everybody's in. So it's time for us to begin. Welcome to the first of two escape room panels at this year's PAX Australia. I'll be your moderator for this panel. I'm Ben McKenzie. Hi. You might remember me from such things as the improvised comedy D&D show Dungeon Crawl or the immersive bank heist adventure Small Time Criminals. But just to clear it up at the start, I am not the same Ben McKenzie as the one on Gotham. Completely different one. I get a surprising amount of fan email for him. Now, just hands up here, who has played an escape room? Oh, nearly everyone, amazing. Right, and who has ever thought, after playing one, I'd like to build one of those?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right. Well, today we're going to find out from experts who've done just that, discussing everything from the planning phase through the build, all the way through to getting people in the door and out again, assuming you haven't made the puzzles too hard. So let me introduce our panelists. They are all owners and operators of escape rooms around Australia, starting here on my left. Mark Anton brings 20 years of IT experience to Social Escape in Alexandria in Sydney, as well as designing and building his own rooms. Mark developed a system for tracking and monitoring a team's progress to help GMs know when to assist players. Next to him, we'll applaud everybody. We'll applaud everyone at the end. And I only say that not because I don't think they all deserve separate applause, but because when I looked at how many things we need to get through on this panel, I was like, we've only got an hour. So we'll applaud them all at the end, if that's all right with you. Leanne Yong, next to Mark, is an editor and writer who runs Next Level Escape in the Sydney Central Business District. While she's involved in every aspect of designing and running the rooms, her focus is on narrative, puzzle and visual design, and their rooms involve a sense of humour and interaction with live GMs. Marise Watson in the middle comes from a journalism and web design background, but now designs games for the Cipher room in Newtown, Sydney. All the technology in the Cipher room is hidden to preserve the vintage feel, and every puzzle is designed and built in-house by Marise and her co-owner, David. Next to her is Josh Hunt. He had a long journey from a teaching career in the UK to now running the mystery rooms in Fitzroy right here in Melbourne. His focus is on writing the narratives and scripts for the GMs, and also on making an experience that extends beyond the 60 minutes you spend inside the room. And finally at the end we have Joan Caballero. She and her husband ran their own fresh food delivery business until they visited their very first escape room and got the bug. They sold everything they owned to start Labyrinth escape rooms in Parramatta in Sydney, drawing on everything from Resident Evil to the Crystal Maze, Survivor and the Amazing Race for inspiration. Please thank all of our guests. Now, just before we kick off, if you read the blurb for this panel, you'll know that there are prizes today. We will be revealing how you will get one of those prizes at the end. And so just, we've got to, you can save the best bit till last. I'm sure that's a theme that's going to come out. But there are kind of 5 stages of planning and making an escape room that we'd like to go through. And we're going to start at the very start, the initial planning phase, where you get your idea and you want to try and plan what it is you're going to do. And Mark, you were going to start us off with this. Can I ask you, where do you start when you're designing an escape room?
Thanks, Ben. It's a good question. I'm sure a lot of you here have got ideas in your head of puzzles that you've seen and concepts that you'd like to try and build into a room, but there is a lot to get through and build and kind of get planning for before you can actually start making that, and hopefully this discussion can help you get a better sense of what is required. But to kind of give you the basics before you get puzzles on paper, you need to go through things like trying to find a location where you can actually run the escape room. It needs to be big enough to then build what it is you want to create and enough to plan ahead with. There are things like council permits that you need to go through, which can be time consuming and also to some degree expensive and tedious and give you grey hairs like what I've got.
How long would you suggest someone plans in advance, like in order to allow for those kinds of things?
As long as possible.
Right.
I know that when you get these ideas, you do tend to get impatient. You want to get these ideas and start building things because it is exciting. I enjoy what I'm doing, and as I'm sure most of us here do. It's a great career, great job, a great thing to be building games for people to then play, and you get to see the enjoyment that other people get. But yeah, the time to plan, the sooner you do it, the better, because there is a lot to get through. Council approvals will take many months to get through. There's various approvals that you'll need, from things like a DA just to get your company up and running with the change of use of the building to what you want it to be. And then there's construction certificates and occupancy certificates, getting into a bit more technical stuff that you'll need to cover as well, where they make sure that no one's going to die in a fire in your building. But then after that, there's construction as well, and depending on how handy you are, depending on how much you've got a construction background, which I certainly didn't have, you know, Googling for answers and YouTube is your friend when it comes to that. I found that construction is actually not that hard, but it's just these things these are the things that you'll need to go through before anything is tangible that you can actually then show to people.
Yeah, I'll throw this one open to the panelists. One of the things that people ask is how expensive is this to do? Like, how much money should you plan to start with if you want to start up an escape room of your own?
Anything that you think though, double it, and then double that. That's how much it's going to cost. I mean, especially when we first started, we made so many mistakes, so I think it cost us a lot more than it should have. We made mistakes in building props, we made mistakes in building walls, we made mistakes in everything. We thought the cheapest and easiest way was for us to do it ourselves. That was the biggest mistake, I think. I mean, now if I were to do it all over again, I would get in the experts, do it faster, do it quicker, do it cleaner. But I think our rooms, it works because we've got insane asylum, so the cracks in the walls is fine. You know, a broken little chair is fine. But no, if you were going to do it now, do it properly. Get the experts in and get it done quickly. Which,
So spend the money to do it right
spend the
first
money,
time.
absolutely.
Yeah, okay, that sounds like good advice. Now, when you're trying to find a place to put the room, what makes for a good location for an escape room? Can you just put them anywhere, or do you need to think about where you're going to put them?
I would say there is a lot to consider, like we're searching for a location at the moment, and you want to consider things like, for example, who are you targeting? Who's your target market? Is it corporates? Then you want to look in the city, or near parks and stuff like that, industrial parks, but you also don't want to alienate the just the people who are also just enthusiasts, obviously. So you'd really want to know who is your target market, who do I want to go after? If you're at an industrial park, is it easy to drive there? How spread out is your city? There's a lot of things to consider there. And then on top of that, especially if, like what Mark was saying about council things, does it meet a lot of the council requirements, especially if you've got to put that into consideration? Does it have enough fire stairs? Or that kind of thing. Like, does it have
I think the number one thing for me though would be parking. Every time I look for a new location, and we're looking for a new location now as well, we get so many people who call us and ask us, do you guys have free parking? Like, yes, we have free parking, come on over. So for us it's parking and being close to a public transport.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Sorry?
For us, we wanted to have it close to bars and restaurants as well. So that's why
that's a good one.
we put ours on King Street in Newtown, because because people can then go out afterwards. It's close to public transport. Being right in the city, no one's expecting parking necessarily, unfortunately. But that was a big thing for us choosing, and also to try and get a place that is big enough.
Mm. Yeah.
But you can build a room in a small space though. I've seen escape rooms, really good ones, in like a bathroom-sized room, and you just make do with what you have. If that's all you can find at the time, then you just got to get creative as well in setting them. So.
Now, one thing that people may not know is that there's actually an entire industry of people who make and sell kits for escape rooms with ready-made puzzles and pieces and bits that you can order online, and it's a huge industry. But I think all of our panelists make and design their own puzzles. Do you have any experience with that? Is there what would make you choose one over the other? And is there a definite advantage to making it all yourself when you're planning what you're going to do?
I'll add in here, I actually did purchase some puzzle ideas for one of my games in the beginning when I was opening up. Predominantly because I wanted to have 2 games to start with, and I wanted one to be a much more challenging game. I didn't feel confident enough making complex puzzles. It's easy to make puzzles that are very difficult to solve, but you also want the puzzles to be satisfying to solve, and I didn't feel that I was going to do it justice. What I learned and what I found through the searching for vendors is that there are many of them out there. It's very hard to know which ones are good and which ones aren't. And they all vary in prices, from some vendors that will charge you a few $100s for a few PDFs that you'll then print out and try and then fit into your game, into your theme, all the way up to hundreds of thousands of dollars where they'll actually build the room and deliver it to you, set it up and train you on how to run it. So the budget that you'll need to then buy one of these rooms can vary widely. The more that you do yourself, the more satisfying it will be for you, and the better that you can then support and maintain the room is something that I've learned through the process. But I think in terms of advice, if you are looking to buy something to begin with, is try and read some reviews from the vendors. Try and find reputable vendors that have got some good reviews, some people's feedback that you can see on the Facebook groups and the other groups that people are sharing positive things about them. And also try and make sure you're not going to a vendor that is reselling somebody else's ideas. There are some out there that are unscrupulous and taking plans that they've purchased and then selling them on again. So just be very careful about that. So I would suggest you still do a bit of research.
I'd also add, be cautious if you're getting a certain prop and it's like a key prop for your room. Make sure you get more than one of them, and be aware of how it's built so that if that company stops making that product, that your room doesn't then not work anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, look, I think we better move on to the next section. So that's a bit about what are the things you've got to think about when you're planning initially the room. But once you figure out where you want to put the room and a bit about where you're going to source the puzzles from or how you're going to make them yourselves, you need to think about what the concept or theme, a narrative of the room is going to be. Now, Leanne, what do you need to think about when you're choosing that theme?
So I will preface this by saying there is always going to be a market for rooms such as, you know, spies or zombies or heists and things like that. Pirates. Like, I mean, they're evergreen, there's always going to be. But when you're thinking about narrative, you also need to keep in mind, if you open a room, people don't remember you really by your name or your brand. They'll remember you as that pirate room, in our case that library room, that screwball FBI agent room, that kind of thing. And so, you know, it really is in your favor to think about themes that, well, A, you personally enjoy, that you're passionate about, and that can differentiate you somehow from the other rooms out there. I mean, if you're in a small town and you're the only one there, okay, not a big deal. But if you're in larger cities, there are a lot of rooms out there, and you do want to be remembered as, you know, oh yeah, that room. You know, someone says like the library room, then okay, it's that, it's those guys. And the thing is, you can make rooms out of any kind of thing. Like, it all depends on getting that narrative. And as a writer, I can tell you can make a narrative out of pretty much anything. Like, for example, if you said you had an old person's home, you could have, you know, escape from the old person's home before you're euthanized by your family.
Oh, this got dark.
Or the dementia resident decides to bash your head in.
Yes. So yeah, and also the other thing to think about with the themes is that lean into, you know, stuff that you think you're really passionate about. Like myself and Aaron, who's the other owner at Next Level. He's like, we've got narrators who interact with the gamers in the room, and we lean into the humor side of things, because that's again part of what we use to differentiate ourselves. And when you're thinking about that, you know, like what interests me, what makes me laugh, or what makes me happy, you know, you could have someone who's like, you know, we've got a narrator who's Stanley Parable style kind of narrator, if you've ever played that game, or a very Portal style AI narrator who's, you know, totally not going to kill you. So things like that.
Yeah. Now, one thing I'm interested in is, you know, we'll talk about how you marry the two together in a bit, but when you're approaching writing the story for an escape room, what are the considerations that make it different, not just from other written media like TV or film, but also from other games media? What do you need to consider when writing a narrative for an escape room that you don't need to worry about when you're writing other sorts of things?
Players won't do what you want them to do. So it's probably more similar to video game media than movies and things like that. Movies that you've got start, beginning, end. You don't have many movies that have got multiple choices. Whereas with the video games, it's quite common. And I think more video games are now going down that line, even ones that were more traditionally linear are now starting to have multi-path and diverse endings. And I think we're going to start seeing that more in the escape room industry, because players want to have that option. They're part of the game, they're a character. They're not just a bystander that comes in and does what they're told. They're actually going to interact. They're going to break stuff, try stuff, force stuff, do stuff you don't want them to, do things you won't expect them to. And sometimes what they'll do is better than what you designed, and you may change something.
The other thing I would add on with the narrative inside an escape room and how it makes it different is that there's a limited time that people have inside your game. So, ergo, they've got limited reading ability. They're not going to be able to read large passages of text to try and absorb a storyline. And there's also a lot of time pressure, so these people are stressed intentionally inside the game and anxious to try and get through within the time limit. So they're not also going to absorb it as well as what you would otherwise if you're reading a book or playing a computer game or watching a film.
Yeah. So you want to get to the point quickly, really. Yeah. It also sounds very similar to being a dungeon master or game master in a tabletop role-playing game, because players never do what you want them to do. Not that I had experience with that. Anyway, so one other thing I want to ask is, because we're going to talk about puzzles next, but when you are designing the theme of the game and how it all fits together, do you come up with a narrative first and then make puzzles that fit it, or do you have a few puzzles that you really like and then try to find a narrative that fits them, or is it kind of somewhere in between where you kind of do both at the same time?
We like to come up with a theme first, and in that theme, in that world, we like to think, okay, what would you find inside that room? For example, we have a Mexican cartel room. My husband is from Mexico, and we really drew on inspiration from his background. We went to Mexico and we wanted to discover their culture, and although we didn't find any cocaine bricks, we do have that inside the Mexican cartel room. So,
we should compare fake cocaine recipes after the show.
Yes, we should.
Small time criminals as well.
So we definitely have. You want to try and for us, I don't know how everyone else designs, but when we're thinking of our storyline and our world, we really want to think of what would you find. So for a Mexican cartel, you'll find guns, you'll find drugs, you'll find dead bodies, you'll find things like that, and then from there, then it's how would you turn that into a puzzle, not the other way around. Because then if I was really stuck on this pirate box that I really wanted to use, it's like, how am I going to fit this pirate box in a Mexican cartel? It just doesn't make sense. So for us, it's find your world, find what you're passionate about, and then from there, think of what objects would be inside that world in your theme, and then make puzzles out of that.
Yeah. What about the goal of the game? Just one quick question on narrative. Most escape rooms, obviously, the goal is very clear, it's to get out of the room, but you do see quite a few where they try to build some other sort of storyline where you're trying to solve a mystery along the way, that kind of thing. How important do you think that is? And I mean, when we're talking about people have a limited amount of time to absorb story anyway, is that important, or is that fairly clear and obvious goal enough?
I would flag that one thing we have noticed is if you advertise yourself as an escape room, a lot of people just go in and they're like, puzzle, puzzle, puzzle. If you're trying to put story in there, you will find some groups get it, they love it, but there's so many groups that go in and they're just like, just solve all the puzzles and we don't really care what's going on, especially if you're not really telling your story within the puzzles themselves, like the very specific puzzles, and even then half the time they're just like, hey, I solved this puzzle, keep going, what code do I have, or what just happened? So it's something to keep in mind. If you want, and people have very specific expectations when you say escape room, like they automatically connect to solving things. So there are other ways to approach it. Definitely, I'm not saying don't do it because it should be broader. It would be amazing to have one where you can wander through where there are experiences that are now coming up like that. But then it's also setting that expectation for people so that they go in knowing, I guess, more or less what to expect.
Yeah. Okay, well let's have a talk about the puzzles and the structure of the game. And Josh, we thought we'd start off with you for this section. How do you approach puzzle design?
So with puzzle design, you've got sort of two main fields of thought, which is the linear puzzle, which is box A, you open it, gives you a clue to box B, B open C, continue on, game ends. And then you have sort of multi-path or non-linear games. Now there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So linear is very good for beginners, very good for small groups, terrible for big groups, and enthusiasts don't really like linear rooms quite so much. And then the opposite with non-linear games, they're not great for small groups because they can't do all of the puzzles, there won't be enough for them to do. And they're a lot harder because you don't know what goes with what. So you have to decide what kind of room you're going to design and what your audience is. One of the worst things you can do is create a room that is for 2 to 10 players. If it's for 2 players, there's not enough for 10 people to do. If it's to 10 players, 2 people are never going to complete it. So you need to work out what your audience is and how many people are going to play it. And then from there, then that starts to guide you on what your puzzles will be.
Yeah, cool. And do you, if you're doing a linear room, for example, do you design the puzzles all together, or do you design the first puzzle and then think, okay, what would be a cool puzzle to come after this one?
I would have all of the puzzles sketched out that I want, and I would probably have 3 to 4 times as many puzzles as I'd want in the room. and then pick the ones that were the best, and then through testing the ones that work the best, and then change them over as you need to. But also trying to appeal to everyone's different brain type. So it kind of sneaks
Yeah, like
into
you're not going to put all
psychology.
maths problems
Yeah.
in a room.
Yeah, so there's sort of two fields of puzzles, which is a heart puzzle, which is the riddle style puzzle. You suddenly have that moment when you're, I know exactly how to solve this. And then you have process puzzles, which are more like mazes and things like that. You look at it, you know what you've got to do, you now just have to do it. If you have all of one set of those puzzles in the room, it's going to be a boring room. And if you have all the heart puzzles in the room, it's going to be too out there, too complicated, and people are going to need too many clues. So you need a good mix of the two, so that you appeal to all the different brain types that might be in your room.
Yeah, cool. How about the other panelists? Is there anything you'd add to how you design puzzles for your business?
I'm very low tech in my puzzle design. I use this thing called post-it notes, and whenever I come up with an idea, I just write down a post-it note and I just sort of do like a flow chart. Very early days, and then from there we will develop the way the puzzles will go. But anyone else use post-it notes or just me?
Well, for me, what I like to do is set up different streams of puzzles. So I have, say, one stream where I know this puzzle is going to lead here to make a non-linear game. Then I have over here another puzzle that I know is going to lead here and here and here, and then they come together at the end. So maybe you find two things you need over in this side, two things here. Those four things come together to open something, maybe a new section of the game, and then you can move on. So that's how I do the,
I think for me, I'm always designing puzzles. And
Yeah.
I'm always kind of cataloguing ideas and concepts onto my computer.
It's
and
true.
then
You're always looking at something and sending us pictures. Like, hey guys, I'm in an escape room. It's just like a picture on the wall.
Yeah.
Like, is this a puzzle?
So with that, when it does come time to try and then assemble them into an escape room, into a set of puzzles that you want to then build a game out of, it doesn't necessarily, it's not important, I should say, in terms of which order you design them in, but once you've kind of compiled them into a sequence, I find the way I prefer to do it is to have a set of easier puzzles that then lead to a harder puzzle, so kind of milestones, you get through a few easy steps and then get to a harder one. So I try and arrange the puzzles in that kind of way. And then through testing, once you get some teams in, you test it and you change it and tweak it, and using either post-it notes or a flowcharting software to then map out the path through the game.
Yeah. Now, are there any tips or tricks or rules you have for yourselves when you're designing puzzles? Like things you think you should always do or things you should absolutely avoid that makes the puzzles really not great?
no outside knowledge.
Mm.
Would be good.
Pretty
I think
good.
that's
Right.
a big one, because we've had a few puzzles that we tried and we realised that people don't know these things. So we had to check them out. So yeah.
So not relying on general knowledge. Sort of, yeah. Okay. 'Cause you
Well,
just,
there was one puzzle in my Mexican cartel room where you had to identify the person wearing a fedora, and then we tested it with a bunch of kids and they didn't know what a fedora was. I was like, okay, take that word out, it's now a hat.
Say, I will say they think they know what a fedora is, but that's the internet's fault. And they're wrong. So yeah, okay, cool. Any other ones?
I would say if you can do it in newspaper, it shouldn't be in an escape room. So Sudokus, crosswords, word searches,
Or Facebook puzzles, no one's with the bucket.
yeah, all those style of things. If you can do them elsewhere, then why are people paying to come and play your game if they could just go and buy some?
Yeah.
I will also flag, this might be more of a personal peeve, and I don't know how controversial this is, but trial and error puzzles, like they
Yeah,
are my
terrible.
pet peeve. I hate them because you're not really solving a puzzle. You're saying, if I put this here, does this work? No, not quite. Okay, let's move it over here, see if this works. And there's no real puzzling involved. You're just like, let's just try it all and see what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a desperate strategy that some players will adopt no matter what kind of
Yeah,
puzzle you
that's
make.
true.
So don't force them to do it. Yeah, that's fair enough. Now, one other thing about the structure when you're designing the puzzles that also we talked about the structure of the game. What about the length of the game? What do you think is the sweet spot? And are there pros and cons to having shorter or longer session times? Because most, I think, escape rooms do have a 60-minute time frame, but there are shorter ones, like 45 minutes, and even longer ones of 90. What are your feelings about that?
People need toilet breaks.
I
it's
think
longer.
my brain just gets fried. I've done rooms back to back, so 3 hours in a row. I think we actually did mystery rooms, Marise and I. We went and did mystery rooms, and by the time we got to the third room, which was his sand room, which was so cool and so amazing, my feet were very happy to be in sand, but also, but I was so it was so awesome. Whose phone?
Sorry.
Hello.
Sorry, it's not actually a phone. There's a code in that message. If you write down the musical notes. that's not true.
She called the game master for a hint.
Lifeline.
With the length of the game as well, it does come down to how much money you can make in the time, which is it's a bit mercenary. We're doing it for you guys. We want you to have a great time, but we are running a business. So if you do a 90-minute game, you've got to charge a premium for it, and people won't necessarily pay it. They'll look at other games that are 60 and they'll go and do those. If you're doing a 45-minute game and you're charging the same as a 60, you've got the opposite situation. You also have to take in your reset into account, briefing, how long players are going to arrive. Players are late all the time, so don't be late to your game. Never be late to your escape room.
Yeah, it really messes us up.
Yeah, so you have to take that into account. So the 45-minute game that you're paying for is actually an hour-and-a-half game that we're running from our side. So making those longer games, as great as they are, is a lot more costly.
Actually, you brought up the reset there, and this is something that I think maybe a lot of players don't think about when they're playing an escape room. What tips do you have for designing puzzles that are easy to reset? And is that important, or do you think you just have to make the puzzle right and then just find the time to reset it, even if it's difficult?
I think reset's so important. I mean, I, as a owner, as well as someone who game masters and then watching my game masters, like as for myself who's designed it and built it, I think it's easier for me, but then when you have to train someone who didn't design it and who doesn't have the knowledge and the thought process behind them, they need to be able to do it as quickly and as precisely as you, so that it's as good for the next team as it was for the last. So you do need to make your resets quickly, so not a lot of moving parts, or as little as possible, I think is important. Things that don't break as well, like you don't want to be resetting and something's, a cocaine brick's breaking in your hand and there's powder everywhere.
Well, maybe you do.
Yeah, I literally still have tiny plastic diamonds in the pocket of this coat from Small Time Criminals, which closed nearly 2 years ago. They're right there. They get everywhere. Those are we switched from those ones to bigger ones for that reason.
I was just going to add, in the latest game that I did build, I actually spent longer to build the game, and I planned more and spent more in order to make the reset quicker.
Yeah.
Because the way I realise it from a business perspective is that resets take time. Typically my games take about 7 minutes to reset, which you don't think is much. But when you're resetting that game 7 or 8 times a day, and you're doing that throughout the week, and you add up those minutes over a year, shaving a little bit of time off that reset can then add up to a lot of time that you're saving each week and each year, which means money.
Yeah.
Or time you could spend on Facebook.
Talking
Looking
about
at
puzzles.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the next part. Once you've got the narrative, you've got your concept, you've designed your puzzles, and you know where you're putting the room, you've got to build the thing. So you've got to design the set, and you've got to think about the immersion. And this is a word that, I mean, I'm interested actually, we'll get onto that actually in a second. Well, no, that's where we're going to start. And Marise, I'm going to start with you. Sorry. But any time you read about an escape room, one of the things that, the words that is always used is immersive or immersion, or, and it can seem like a bit of a buzzword, but what does it mean to you and why is it important?
Well, at the Cipher room, we do spend a lot of time on set design and the immersion of the game. We want people to feel drawn into the experience and connected to the games and the themes that we've set up. So we do, David and I build, as you said before, we build everything ourselves there. So the Marlow Hotel, for example, our last game took us 9 months. And again, most of that was building the set and getting it right. This was a black and white game, so everything had to be painted just right. We had to source props. But yeah, I think that with immersion, I think it really does help people to suspend their disbelief when they're in the game. It helps with the gameplay as well, and also we have a thing where we try and use genuine materials in the game. For example, we have a cabin game, and we have deliberately used authentic materials in that space, so that it is real. In a sense, you feel like you're not on King Street, Newtown. You're actually in a cabin in the woods. So a lot of that is we don't use wallpaper to do the effects for us. For example, in the cabin we have corrugated iron on the wall. We have real corrugated iron because we like the texture of it, the look of it, and even weirdly the smell. It's quite authentic. Yeah, another big thing I suppose that we do spend a lot of time on is sound and lighting as well. So we have I did sound design design, and for the cabin, for example, I wanted to have wind sounds, so it feels like the wind is coming through the cabin. There's dripping water, there's animal sounds, things like that, that when you walk in blindfolded and you're hearing your brief, it helps put you in the scene before the door closes. Take your blindfolds off and you're there. Same with the Marlow, we used a lot of sound design in that game where I researched old car sounds. We're in an alleyway, because I want it to sound like 1950s New York. So murmuring crowds, streetscape noises and things like that. So with lighting, that's the other big one that we use a lot of. And lighting is amazing, it can just really transform a room. We use it to pinpoint areas that we want people to start looking at, for example. But also we can hide things in the shadows and it just adds that atmosphere.
And do you ever work with professional set or lighting designers, like who might work in theatre or film? Have you worked? No. Can I just, as a thing I will add, I recommend it. We worked with a professional lighting designer who had a theatre background on Small Time Criminals, and it just like lifted the whole experience. Because it was supposed to be at night time, we lit the whole thing in blue, so it felt like a cinema nighttime scene, and you know it was great. But enough about it. We don't need to talk about it. But you mentioned that you have corrugated iron on the walls in that room, and this brings up like one of the big concerns when you're building the thing and putting it together, is how do you make this not just robust so that it won't fall apart when people touch it, but how do you make it safe when you're using authentic kind of materials and maybe heavy props that are real?
Occupational health and safety is so important, and so when we build something, we make sure it's very well attached to the walls and the ceiling, because we have corrugated iron on the ceiling, which was a horror to put up. But yeah, so you just make sure that there's no sharp edges, that things are well constructed.
There's no nails sticking out.
No nails sticking out, no splinters or anything like that. So
No
you
high
just have to be
voltage.
careful.
Yeah.
Yes.
I can connect to you, yeah.
Yeah, great. And now you mentioned also sourcing props, and you wanted to go for authentic props. Where does everyone get your props for the rooms from? Do you just raid like sort of second-hand shops? Do you order stuff online? Do you have a particular prop in mind, or do you go out looking for something that's quite, that fits without knowing exactly what it's going to be? How do you find those props?
Lots of vintage
Yeah,
shops.
yeah, absolutely. There's a place in Marrickville called Reverse Garbage. It's amazing. It's my favourite place on earth, and I find a lot of really good stuff there. So when we're building our insane asylum, we found this really amazing, I think it was like, I don't even know what, I was going to say 70s, but I actually don't think it is. It was like this old medical bed, the ones that, people use in hospitals. I don't know what
A gurney.
Yes, a gurney, that thing. So we have that, and that was really cool to find, and it was quite cheap especially at Reverse Garbage. Whereas if I went online and tried to look for that, it was like something like $1,000. So, oh, that's applause.
That's okay. I suspect you know that sound well enough.
Yeah.
Quite so.
I was going to add to that and say many times I don't actually know exactly what I'm out there looking for. You go out there with an open mind, going to Reverse Garbage or second-hand stores or looking on Gumtree. You don't quite know what you need until you find something that fits. And at that point you'll then buy it and try and then adapt it to then fit into putting puzzles into it or building something around it.
Like we went to a reclaimed wood place in Sydney that they've got like a ton of reclaimed doors, wood, all kinds of awesome stuff. Wasn't quite sure what we were looking for, but decided to go and take a look anyway. Came away with like 2 fireplace mantles. Half the time you don't really know, you see it and you're like, oh, that would be perfect.
One day.
Yeah, we have the same similar thing. We have a Ned Kelly room, and we've managed to get a prison door from Pentridge Prison.
Oh, wow.
So the entrance door to the game is actually a prison door that Ned Kelly potentially could have walked through. And then we stripped it all back, and the way we got it was that we had a deal with Pentridge Prison, and they needed pictures of us stripping it back, and then they put some stuff up at the prison about how we're using it, and that the sort of the story of the place continues. So they were really happy with that.
I think it's really important to also be very authentic with the props that you have in the game to the theme of the game. So for example, we've got a 1940s spy game, and we don't have it so that there's things in the room that are jarring. So you don't walk in and see an iPad on the wall or something if it's supposed to be 1940s. So we do take a lot of trouble to find even the right decade specific stuff. I found, for example, a USSR binoculars that I use in one game. So yeah, they're actually made in USSR, which is crazy. So
Yeah, wow.
yeah.
There's an unwritten contract between the player and the games master, that when you guys come into play, you know you're not going into space. You're not going on an alien spaceship. You're not going back to the 1880s. So your contract is that you're gonna abide by the fact that if we put it in there, you're like, yep, okay, that's where we are. I accept that reality. And then our contract to you is that we will not ever put something in there that makes it jarring to you. So if you're going back to ancient Egypt, you're not going to come across a laser maze. You're not going to...
Unless it's a Stargate thing.
But also in saying that, going back to props, for Mexican Cartel, I said we actually went to Mexico, so we just went and bought a whole heap of Mexican ponchos and sombreros and all these props, just to make the room and feel great, and everyone loves wearing them and putting all these outfits and
And the bricks of cocaine.
and the bricks of cocaine.
It's all there. No, it's I apologise. Now, once you've built the room, once you've designed it, once you've put it together, you've got everything together, then there's still two very important things that you need to do. You need to test the room and you need to promote it. And Joan, I want to start with you to talk about this. You know, how much do you test them and how important is testing?
Oh my god, testing is so important. I think we spent a good month before we've even told anyone about our room on testing. So we like to get in before friends and family first. But you know, friends and family are actually the worst because they don't tell you the truth. So you'll get your mum in. My mum loves it. She's like, oh, you're so amazing, and I don't know what to do in this room, but she's always so encouraging. And you know, so friends and family, they don't really tell you the truth, but it's when you get your customers coming. So we like to keep a list of past customers who we think would be really great at testing. So you know, you can have a room of about we like to do 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So every group size come in and test, and we do that for about a good month. But when we're also testing, we also like to see the consistencies. You know, if you have one person who says, well, I don't really like that puzzle, I'm not going to listen to that person unless 20 people tell me, I don't really like that puzzle, it doesn't make sense, there was no connection at all, I didn't make that, there was a big jump. So testing is super important.
Yeah. From all of the panelists, what are the things that you wish you'd known about testing the game before you did it? Like, what advice would you give to someone if they've got a puzzle room or an escape room and they're starting to test it? What do they need to know in that process?
I think fundamentally their testing never actually stops. I've been running games for over 2 years now and I'm still testing, still tweaking, still modifying clues. It just never ends.
Yeah, you'll find when you first open that most of the people that are going to come to you are the early adopters, which are going to be the enthusiasts. They are completely different to 2 years down the line, the people that are coming in there. So you may find that your game evolves over time and you do start having to make it easier. We've recently really got busy with kids' birthday parties, like 10-year-old kids. They love it, but the games now have to change because of those groups. And we don't want to turn them away because it's good business.
But then do you change it for them specifically and then change it back for adults? Okay, cool.
Yeah, we found that with small-time criminals, although there's some things we couldn't change, which was like, if you're a 10-year-old kid, you just couldn't physically open the bank vault. It's too big a door. So we just told them, you have to bring in an accomplice. Your dad or your mum. With a mask, it's fine. They loved it. They love making their parents do illegal things. Too true. Do you need to have the whole room completed before you start testing, or can you test some of the puzzles on their own during the design process?
I would actually flag that you may want to try and test some of them earlier because you don't want to get to the point where you have built, let's say, an entire thing with lots of moving parts, lots of electronics, and then you find out partway through testing that actually this would have been much better split up, and then you've got to find other ways around it after that. Like, this is if we could go back and tell ourselves this would definitely be a thing. Start testing earlier, start testing parts of it, certain elements to see, does it work, bit by bit. You still have to do the end to end, but does it work bit by bit? Because you don't want to go and build that thing you spend months building and be like, can we actually saw this in half or will that not work? The answer is it won't work. So you do want to try and get elements of it done as early as possible.
Yeah. Is there anything you've learned from testing that you now take into every new design, like any sort of universal lessons that you've learned from the testing process?
I think I learnt a lot after the first testing period of our first game because we staggered our launches. So yeah, there were certain things that I just knew weren't going to work by the time we got to game 3. But yeah, I think that add more puzzles. This is something that I just naturally do. I have way too much puzzles, and then you can take some out. It's much better than having to panic and go, oh my god, we're launching next week.
We don't have enough puzzles.
Yeah. So make more.
It's only a 30-minute game and you pay for 60. Yeah.
But what I find really fascinating is the fact that almost every single game I've done, I've created. There's been puzzles where I've gone, this is the easy one, this is the one everyone's going to like, and it's always been the hardest puzzle, no matter what. So yeah, it's unpredictable, and it's so important to sort of give yourself as many weeks as possible for testing.
Yeah.
I would say you've not built it strong enough would be the thing. But every time you finish the game and you put it in and you realise you've not built it strong enough,
Things always
people will break everything.
What's the saying? That your customers have the mind of a toddler but the strength of Hulk. So it's true. They just want to pull everything apart, but they're so strong.
We'd just like to say that we love all of you. We believe you have also great minds. Anyway, now, once you've built it, you tested it, it's ready for the public, how do you get people to come? What do you do to attract people to your escape room? Obviously, you put the word out there, the enthusiasts are going to come because they're always looking for new rooms to open. But what are some ways that and particularly things that are unique to marketing an escape room rather than some other sort of business?
You arrange to come to PAX and do a panel.
Is anyone opening up a new room soon?
The social's massive. It's huge for everything.
Even before social though, it's with your word of mouth, your actual customers. When you get there and you secretly whisper, "Hey, we're going to be opening a new room," just keep it secret.
Actually,
they tell everyone.
Should we do a sneaky bit of quick market research? Think about the last escape room you went to. If you heard about it on social media, can you put up your hand? If you heard about it from someone else who went there, can you put up your hand? Yeah, see, a lot more. Word of mouth is hugely important.
Or you could just put a cash prize into your game.
Oh yes.
Actually, can I add one more question? If you heard about it by searching through Google, could you put up your hand?
Yeah, we need the lights up to see the hands. Let's go down.
Is the spotlight on me or?
Yeah, that's right. What was that last one? Can we do that one again?
If you heard about it by searching through Google, could you put your hand once more?
Oh, great. Okay, interesting. If you have no idea how you got into the room, just get in there with it. I've got one last question on this before we open it up to a few questions from the audience, because we've got just enough time for a few. But my last question is, do you collaborate with other rooms to help people? Because it's one of those unique businesses where you're kind of in competition with each other, but at the same time, people can't come and do your room more than once. So you can collaborate with other businesses. Is that something that you do?
I do.
Oh, all the time.
I mean, obviously you're all here on the same panel, so I assume you don't hate each other.
We're all good friends.
Yeah,
And we've
absolutely.
got flyers to all the other escape rooms in our foyers.
Yeah.
And
when you're fully booked one night, you'll just send them to the next
Yes.
closest escape room. So Scram Escape Room is our closest out in Parramatta, and if they're full, we'll say, okay, now go out to Social or go out to Cipher or go to Next Level.
Yeah, I think
Not
it's
Mystery Room,
really-
sorry, because you're in Melbourne.
Unless you fancy a road trip.
Yeah.
I think it's really important also to promote other independent escape rooms. We don't have the biggest budgets, and so we all try and help each other out by, as you said, putting brochures and everything of other businesses that we really like and we want to support in our reception.
Yeah, that's really good.
And it helps when your staff love escape rooms. They're like, yeah, and I've been to this one and it was awesome, or you've played them yourselves.
Yeah.
And because you've only got a limited amount of rooms. It really helps.
Share the love, guys.
Yeah. You don't want people to go into the crap, should there be any. You don't want them to play one and be like, oh my gosh, what is this? And walk out and never play an escape room again because their friends are like, let's go. And they're like, I've tried that sucked.
Exactly.
You want them to go in there and be like, I want to play 10,000 more.
Refer them to the good ones.
Yeah, great. All right, we've got just enough time to take a small number of audience questions. I believe we have a volunteer with a microphone who's going to come around to the people asking so that we can definitely hear. Yep, they've got the microphone. We might take, there's one in the middle over here. Yes, you?
Lots of good ones.
Yeah. Take yours first.
Hi, I was wondering what you tell your staff about giving clues. Do you all have this kind of similar clue policy, or is it something that you do individually decide?
Good
on
question.
your own?
Personally, I give unlimited hints.
We only give 5.
We give unlimited, but we actually don't give clues. We have a policy, I want people to get the answers themselves. So we ask people, would you like us to direct your attention to something? And then they can say yes or no. So they control their own game, and we're not giving them a clue if they don't want one.
Great. Okay. Who else got a question? We've got one down the front here. This one here.
Yeah, question is for anyone. How do you test your puzzles before you make them? Like in their kind of idea stage?
So while you're still designing them, before they physically exist, do you test the design somehow? And how do you do that?
I think it's less about testing the design and more about testing a prototype.
Yeah. How do you go about that?
Yeah. What do you do for prototyping? Do you make like in game design, often with tabletop or with digital game design, we'll make a paper prototype. Do you do that sort of thing?
Well, often the puzzles are made of timber, so the same concept would apply. We'd make something in a much more rudimentary manner. We wouldn't try and decorate it, wouldn't paint it, wouldn't try to make it look nice. We'd just make something that is functional, and then maybe give it to my employees to then see how long it takes them to complete it, and then I use that to then build the rest of the game around it, use it as a building block.
I will say we've used paper prototypes as well, because it's literally like, pretend this is a wheel on the thing, even though it's like this lopsided oval, and if you turn it, then, you know, it's meant to work in this way, and test the puzzle concept that way. It's like, do you get the idea that you're meant to turn it this way? Are there enough clues around it that make you think, oh, I should go here and then here, and, you know, in these specific manners? And you can do a lot with paper prototyping in that sense, where you just like, please just pretend. We test it like, we've tested it on our manager, I've tested it on, you know, housemates, anyone and everyone, for people who know what they're doing to those who have no clue. And it's very useful. Just draw, cut it out, and see whether the mechanic itself and maybe, you know, the clues around it work.
Okay. We've got time for a few more questions. Take one from over here. Yeah.
Hi guys. I'd like to talk about the end game. Obviously some people aren't going to make it through your escape rooms. How do you make a failure to get out a positive experience?
I cheated by making a game you couldn't fail to get out of. So I can't contribute to this answer.
We've built in a fail state, so if the players do still fail, there's still story, and there isn't an ending for that. And then just really good customer service when they come out of the room. You're the best, you guys did amazing at that puzzle, fastest I've ever seen do that element.
Everybody in the room is like, oh, you said this to
Highlight where they did really well, and then draw their attention to areas that they may not have done so well, just so they can improve for their other games. Like, oh, you're searching, you've spent a little bit longer on searching than you possibly needed to. Don't be afraid to get clues, things like that, and just make them feel amazing. And it's the same for if a group smashes the room as well. Sometimes that can be a negative. If groups are really, really good, they expected a 60-minute experience and they finish in 45. Some groups get annoyed with that. So it's just working with them and just really falling back on really great customer service.
Yeah, nice one. Okay, we've got lots more questions. We'll take one from up the back on this side. Yeah. Yeah, funny, I know you're sitting both together. I'm going to let you figure out which one it is.
Thank you for creating this industry, or helping this industry grow, but innovation can come from two places, like you always improving yourself, and it leads with your question of collaboration, competition. Where do you feel innovation comes from the escape room businesses, basically? Like, it sounds like you're always improving your puzzles over time, and that's where it comes from.
I like to go to other escape rooms just to see where, you know, the level of quality of rooms are at. When we first opened 3 years ago, there weren't many escape rooms, so we like to be as good as everyone around us. Now, having been 3 years on, there's always more better escape rooms that are emerging, and so we always want to try and be, you know, as good as them, because you just want to make the industry as strong as possible. If you don't, then the industry is going to fall within the next 3 to 5 years. So we want to be here for the next 10 years, 20 years. Still be making escape rooms in my nursing home, so. Yeah.
That's the nursery.
We'll take another one from the back. You can see this one in the middle there. Yeah.
What's the most baffling thing you've seen a group of players do, and how did you get them back on track?
You know what? That's a whole other panel. But would anyone like to volunteer one?
I did have a girl fall asleep for 40 minutes inside my game.
Was she drunk?
Possibly, but I'm not going to make accusations.
Okay, falling asleep. I was expecting something more outrageous, but okay. Anyone else want to throw one in?
We've had some battling groups where we've had to give them a hint on where to look. And I remember one group in particular, I said, you need to look down, and all of them went up.
Like I said, toddler mind.
People don't always follow instructions. Yeah, like I said, I think that could be a whole other panel. Let's take one from the front, right over on here, about 4 rows back. Glasses over there. Yeah, you. And this will probably be our last question.
When designing a room, at whatever stage, what kind of considerations do you give for guests with disabilities?
It's a really good question.
We actually had the a deaf society come in to our room, and we were able to create our puzzles and clues based on their ability or disability. So our game master, we wrote down all our clues onto sheets, and whenever they needed one, they gave us a sign through our cameras, and then we just put that under the door, and they were able to read it. So
we have all of our games, and the whole space is wheelchair accessible. We also have certain puzzles where you need to perhaps do things like maybe get down or get up. I don't want to say too much, but we've got certain bits of paper that we can sort of use to help people who have mobility issues that can't, say, kneel down or can't move around, to help them with each puzzle.
What about lighting levels? Like low lighting is often a thing for people with vision impairment, and this is a big one because often you want to make the room a little bit dark to preserve the mystery. Do you ever alter those levels or have any changes that you can make based on?
I've got a second light switch that the players can click on to turn on the big fluorescent lights. It does take away the mood, but if they need it, they're welcome to use it.
Yeah. So you can build those things in, and it's I think that is it's a great question because it's an important thing in all forms of games, whether that's digital or tabletop or live action games like escape rooms, to think about those things and build those in, whether that's including symbols as well as colours to identify different things that must match, or whether that's lighting levels, or as you say, being able to have written clues or information as well as auditory clues and information. Now, before we close up, I did say at the start that there'd be prizes, and now is the time. Now, what is going to happen is in a moment I'm going to put on the screen a puzzle that Marise created especially for this. We did make it a relatively easy one so that most people would solve it. If you solve it, you will know what to do to find out if you are a prize winner. Right? Solving the puzzle does not guarantee you win a prize, but it does mean you know what to do to discover what to do. So here we go. I'm going to put it on the screen right now. This is so good. This is like watching this is the biggest escape room.
anyone find out? Yeah.
So for those of you who didn't get it,
There's 11 winners, so you guys are looking. Oh, I got it. Yes. That's not one. That's a chair.
please don't break anything. We didn't follow our own rules.
I did like how those inflective moments of about 20 seconds where everyone's just looking at the screen and all of a sudden everyone changes.
So we now know exactly how difficult that comes. Oh, that's great. That brings us to the end. I will say if you have one of those prizes, inside those envelopes are some vouchers to escape rooms, not just those represented on the panel, but some other friendly escape rooms that we're big fans of. Most of them have quite a long use-by date, at least a year, and in some cases up to 3 years. So do check them out, go and play those rooms, and play all of the rooms here. Can you please join me in thanking all of our panelists? Mark and remember, there is another escape escape room panel. It's called Whose Escape Room Is It Anyway? It's on at 3 p.m. on Sunday afternoon in the Galar Theatre, and we'd love to see you there. Most of these panels are there. I may or may not be there. I don't know. I haven't figured it out yet. I've been Ben McKenzie, and maybe I might even see you at the live Dungeon Crawl show tomorrow night, 9 o'clock in the main theatre. Thank you very much.